Welcome to the DX Today podcast, your daily deep dive into the AI ecosystem. I'm Chris, and joining me as always is Laura.
Thanks, Chris. And what a day to be talking about this. Because on Monday, Apple finally did the thing the entire industry has been predicting, dreading, and joking about for 2 solid years now.
That's right, we are digging into Apple's Worldwide Developers Conference keynote from June 8th, where the company unveiled a Siri that has been completely rebuilt from the ground up on a custom Google Gemini model.
And before anyone thinks this is just another incremental Siri update, let me be clear. This is the most significant overhaul of the Assistant in 15 years, going all the way back to when Siri first launched on the iPhone 4S in 2011.
15 years is a long time to coast. And I think most listeners would agree that Siri spent most of that time as the punchline of the voice assistant world rather than the leader Apple promised us back then.
It really did, and the numbers behind this reinvention are striking. Apple licensed a custom Gemini model of roughly 1.2 trillion parameters in a multi-year deal that reporting pegs at about $1 billion per year flowing from Cupertino to Mountain View.
$1 billion a year sounds enormous to a normal person. But help me put that in perspective against the scale of Apple's business, because I suspect it is actually a rounding error for them in the grand scheme of things.
Oh, it's couch cushion money for Apple, which generates close to $400 billion in annual revenue. For context, Google reportedly pays Apple over $20 billion a year just to be the default search engine in Safari. So, $1 billion going the other direction is almost poetic.
That is a fantastic point, because the money has flowed from Google to Apple for 2 decades. And now for the first time we are watching Apple write checks to Google, because it could not build a competitive frontier model in-house.
Exactly. And that admission is the real story here. Apple tried for years to get its own large language models to a shippable state. The whole Apple Intelligence saga was rocky, the smarter Siri kept slipping, and eventually leadership decided that pride was less important than product.
So walk us through what this rebuilt Siri actually does. Because I think people have heard so many broken promises about voice assistants that they have rightfully become skeptical about anything announced in a glossy keynote video.
Fair skepticism, so here is the concrete list. The new Siri ships as a standalone app on iPhone, iPad, and Mac, working as a full conversational chatbot. It can search your personal context across messages, emails, and photos, execute multi-step commands across apps, answer questions about whatever is on your screen, and pull live information from the web.
The standalone app decision fascinates me because for 15 years, Siri was this disembodied voice you summoned and hoped for the best. And now Apple is essentially admitting that people want a chat interface like ChatGPT and Claude have.
It is a complete concession to the form factor that won. Hundreds of millions of people built a daily habit around opening a chat app and typing or talking to a model, and Apple finally stopped pretending that habit did not exist on its own platforms.
Now let's get into the architecture, because the privacy story is where Apple is trying hardest to differentiate itself. And frankly, it is the part I find most interesting from an engineering and trust perspective.
It is a 3-tier system, and I genuinely think it is clever. Simple tasks stay entirely on device using Apple's own smaller models. Moderately complex requests go to Apple's private cloud compute, which runs on Apple Silicon servers. And only the heaviest reasoning gets routed out to the custom Gemini model running in Google Cloud.
And when those hard queries do land on Google servers, what guarantees does Apple claim are in place? Because that is exactly where privacy-minded listeners are going to want to push back the hardest on this whole arrangement.
Apple says those queries are processed statelessly, meaning nothing is retained after the response comes back. And crucially, the contract explicitly bars Google from training future models on any Apple user data. Google essentially operates as a dumb inference engine that answers and forgets.
Contracts are nice, but enforcement is the eternal question, and I would imagine Apple negotiated audit rights here, given how much of its brand equity is staked on the privacy promise. It has been marketing for a decade.
Reporting suggests Apple had enormous leverage in the negotiation precisely because Anthropic and OpenAI were both circling this deal. Apple ran a genuine bake-off over the past year, and Gemini reportedly won on a combination of price, customization flexibility, and Google's willingness to accept those strict data terms.
Let's talk about the competitive earthquake that decision causes. Because Anthropic and OpenAI losing the Siri contract is a big deal. And yet Apple gave them a surprising consolation prize buried a little deeper in the announcements.
That consolation prize might be the sleeper story of the whole keynote. The new extension system in iOS 27 lets users set a third-party AI model, like Claude or ChatGPT, as their default assistant. That is the first time in iPhone history a user can replace the built-in assistant.
That is genuinely shocking by Apple standards because this is the company that fought tooth and nail for years to stop you from even changing your default browser. And now it is letting another company's brain answer the side button.
And the motivation is two-layered. Partly it is the European Union's Digital Markets Act, which has been forcing Apple to open up defaults across the board. But partly it is strategic insurance, because if Siri stumbles again, Apple would rather keep users inside the iPhone with Claude than lose them to a dedicated AI device from someone else.
I want to pause on the irony here because regulators in the United States spent years litigating the Google search default deal on the iPhone, and now Apple has gone and signed another massive Google dependency, right, as that scrutiny peaked.
The antitrust dimension is fascinating and honestly unresolved. You now have the two most powerful mobile ecosystems on the planet, iOS and Android, both running their flagship assistants on Gemini models. That is a level of concentration in conversational AI that regulators on both continents are absolutely going to examine.
So play devil's advocate with me for a moment. Because someone listening right now is surely thinking that this all sounds like Apple outsourced its most strategic technology and that history rarely rewards companies that rent their crown jewels.
It is a legitimate worry, and there are two schools of thought. The pessimists say Apple just became a beautiful hardware shell around Google Intelligence, repeating the mistake IBM made handing the operating system to Microsoft. The optimists point out Apple did exactly this with Search, collected hundreds of billions in fees, and never lost control of its customer relationship.
The search analogy cuts both ways, though, because in Search, Apple was the toll booth collecting rent, while here Apple is the tenant paying rent. And those are very different positions of leverage over a 10-year horizon.
Beautifully put, and Apple clearly knows it, which is why the deal is structured as a bridge rather than a destination. Reporting indicates Apple is still investing heavily in its own foundation models team, with the explicit goal of swapping its own trillion-parameter model into that third tier whenever it reaches parity.
Which raises the execution question that haunts every Apple AI story. Because the original Smarter Siri was announced in June of 2024 and then slipped repeatedly, so why should anyone believe the timeline this time around?
The difference is that this time the hard part already exists and is proven. Gemini is a shipping, benchmarked, battle-tested model serving billions of queries. Apple's risk now is integration plumbing rather than fundamental research, and integration is the kind of problem Apple has historically been excellent at solving.
Fair enough, and the keynote actually gave us a same-day proof point, because iOS 27 Beta 1 went out to developers that very afternoon with the new Siri included, which is not something Apple did with the Vaporware Air announcements.
Right, the demo gods were kind, and early hands-on reports from developers this week have been cautiously positive. People are testing multi-step commands like finding a photo from a specific trip, editing it, and texting it to a family member. All from one spoken sentence, and it apparently mostly works.
Mostly Works is doing some heavy lifting in that sentence, but honestly, Mostly Works would represent a generational leap for an assistant whose previous signature move was cheerfully setting a timer when you asked it literally anything else.
The bar was subterranean, agreed, and beyond Siri, there were other meaningful pieces in the keynote. The new Shortcuts app now lets everyday users build genuine multi-step automation workflows by describing them in plain language, which quietly brings agent-style computing to 1 billion non-technical people.
That Shortcuts piece deserves more attention than it got, because describing an automation in plain English and having your phone just build it is the kind of feature that changes behavior slowly and then suddenly, like the App Store did.
Completely agree, and there was also the performance story. The whole release is being described as a snow leopard-style cleanup, with Apple claiming up to 30% faster app launches and up to 70% faster photo loading, which suggests they spent real engineering effort on the foundations rather than only the flashy AI layer.
Let's zoom out to the ecosystem chessboard because I want to understand who wins and who loses here, beyond the obvious headline that Google just landed the biggest distribution deal in the history of artificial intelligence.
Google is the colossal winner, full stop. Gemini now sits at the intelligence layer of well over 2 billion devices across both major mobile platforms. For OpenAI, this stings badly because ChatGPT was the original Apple intelligence partner back in 2024, and they have now been demoted from chosen partner to optional extension.
And what about Anthropic in all of this? Because they reportedly came close in the bake-off. And the extension system means Claude can now live on the iPhone as a default assistant for the first time ever.
For Anthropic, it is a silver medal with real upside. They lost the licensing revenue, but Extensions gives Claude direct consumer distribution on the most valuable hardware platform on Earth without paying Apple a dime for placement. For a company whose consumer footprint trails its enterprise strength, that is a meaningful new front door.
There's also the developer angle, because a smarter Siri that can take actions inside third-party apps only matters if developers actually wire their apps into it. And Apple has burned developers with abandoned frameworks before.
True, but the new app intent system is the same plumbing that powers shortcuts and the extensions. So developers build once and get 3 surfaces. Early signals from the developer community this week suggest enthusiasm is genuinely high, because a working Siri finally makes voice a distribution channel worth investing in.
I keep coming back to the consumer experience question, though, because regular people do not care whose model is under the hood. They care whether asking their phone to do something embarrassing in public actually works on the first try.
And that is precisely why Apple buried the Gemini branding so deep. Nowhere in the keynote did Apple celebrate the partnership. There was no Sundar Pichai cameo, just a single quiet architecture slide. Apple wants users to experience a magical Siri, not a licensed Google product wearing an Apple costume.
Which is classic Apple playbook. Take a component from a supplier, wrap it in vertical integration and marketing, and capture the customer loyalty, the same way they did with Samsung screens and Sony camera sensors for years.
Exactly. Intelligence is just the newest commodity component in their eyes. And one more strategic wrinkle worth flagging, the deal reportedly runs on Google Cloud infrastructure with specific capacity guarantees, which means Apple's Assistant quality is now partly hostage to Google's data center build-out keeping pace with demand.
That dependency feels manageable in year 1, but spicy in year 5, especially if the two companies end up competing harder in wearables and home devices, where the previewed Home OS suggests Apple has ambitions that overlap directly with Google's Nest empire.
The Home OS preview was brief but telling. A unified operating system for home devices arriving next year with this new Siri at its center. Apple is clearly betting that a finally competent assistant unlocks the smart home, the car, and eventually some form of ambient wearable computing.
So let's bring this home with the big picture takeaways, because we have covered the deal, the architecture, the regulation angle, and the chess moves, and I want listeners to leave with the 3 things that matter most.
Takeaway 1, Apple just validated the model licensing era, proving even $3 trillion giants will rent intelligence rather than ship a weak product. Takeaway 2, the extension system makes the iPhone an open battleground where Claude, ChatGPT, and Gemini compete for the same button. Takeaway 3, this is a bridge, and the real war begins when Apple's own model is ready.
And my own closing thought is simpler, which is that competition just arrived at the one place it was missing, the default assistant in your pocket, and 1 billion users are about to get dramatically better software because of it.
Could not have said it better, Chris. The 15-year Siri winter might finally be over, and whether the thaw came from Cupertino or Mountain View, users honestly will not care. They will just notice their phone finally listens.
That's all for today's episode of the DX Today podcast. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.